Welcome students to Anthropology 325. This is the lecture on Traditional Subsistence. I'm Alan Boris, and I'm speaking to you from my office here at Kenai Peninsula College. So first of all, an anthropological view of subsistence. We'll take a few slides here to just sort of orient ourselves to how anthropologists view subsistence, and then lead into Denina subsistence. So we can say this is getting and distributing food energy. It's roughly coterminous with the economy, but usually applies specifically to foods, getting foods, distributing foods. There's a general classification of subsistence strategies, and it comes out of the University of Michigan in the 50s and 60s. Hunting and gathering societies, also called food foraging societies, pastoral, horticultural, agricultural, and industrial agricultural societies. These have increasing complexity. Complexity not in the sense of what any one person knows, but complexity in terms of the number of institutions involved. So agricultural societies, for example, have more and varied institutions than pastoral societies, which in turn have more and varied institutions, formal institutions, than hunting and gathering societies. So complexity increases and generally tends to correlate with per capita energy consumption, both food-wise and otherwise, energy-wise. Just to emphasize a point that anthropologists do not view this as progress. Progressivity is not the issue. Often these are characterized in other writings as progress, getting better. It isn't necessarily getting better, it isn't necessarily getting worse, it's just different. In terms of sustainability, however, you could easily argue that hunting and gathering societies are much more sustainable in the long run, certainly than industrial agricultural societies. I doubt if there's many people today that would look at the characteristics of the way things are going, the trajectory of the way things are going today, and say that we are on a sustainable course. In terms of Denina and other salmon cultures, it's also important to point out that because of the nature of salmon, the salmon cultures have many of the characteristics of a horticultural society. Horticultural meaning one that essentially subsistence farming, growing their own foods, hunting some game, supplementing it with wild resources, but not one based extensively on trade. Often these have clan-based systems which organize labor. Often they have some type of leader, some position, formal position of leadership, but not to the extent of agricultural societies and civilizations and state systems and so on. Salmon cultures have these characteristics: clan-based, organizing labor for catching, procuring, storing salmon. Geshka, we talked about among the Denina as a leadership position. And the reason that salmon cultures have many of the characteristics of horticulture is that the salmon are a very secure food resource that only needs to be harvested at a spot. And so many are sedentary, or at least semi-sedentary, and take on characteristics of horticultural societies. Hunting and gathering, then, is any type of subsistence in which a population size is limited by the carrying capacity of the natural environment. I will use natural here in contrast to one based on domesticated plants and animals. So all of the other subsistence strategies that we just mentioned have to one degree or another reliance on domesticated plants or animals. Hunting and gathering do not. Therefore, are limited by the carrying capacity of the natural environment. Carrying capacity is the maximum population reflecting the total amount of food energy available to sustain a species, in this case humans, in a particular ecosystem. So we can speak of the carrying capacity for moose in Cook Inlet. We can speak of the carrying capacity of any animal. We can also speak of the carrying capacity of humans who are living off the land. In terms of human cultures, almost never do they reach 100% of carrying capacity. Wherever there is data, wherever there's information, typically hunters and gatherers achieved about 50% of carrying capacity, and you would want that. If you're at 100% carrying capacity, you're in a very precarious position, and starvation or some other problems will inevitably result. 50% is typical. And we could add as a sidelight, our world system today is moving pell-mell toward 100% of the carrying capacity of the world ecosystem, and many of the problems today can be attributed to that. Back to hunting and gathering. Typically employ optimal foraging strategies. That's nothing more than situate yourself where the food is, minimize the effort to maximize your return. This is not sport hunting. This is subsistence hunting. And, of course, don't take any more than you need because you might need it later. We also can talk a bit about the nutritional value of a hunting and gathering diet. So one view is that all humans have evolved to metabolize food similarly and have the same daily nutritional requirements. But there's some evidence to suggest this isn't exactly the case, and that nutritional requirements are affected by enculturation, and that is how your body has adapted to use foods, and perhaps how the body and various cultures have evolved to use foods. It appears to take about 4,000 years for that type of evolution to occur, and it means having a sustained diet of a similar type over those 4,000 years. So the human enzyme producing capacities may adapt long term to metabolize meat, such that plant foods are minimally necessary. So some evidence for that. The Chipewyan, the Canadian Athabascans, ate no plant foods, or at least the ethnographic literature indicates they ate no plant foods, even though they were available, and obviously survived. So if that data is true, if that ethnographic information is true, they must have adapted somehow to that feature. The Tachoni, also an Athabascan group in Canada, had a documented diet of 95% meat and fish, 4% carbohydrates mainly from berries, and only 1% starch from bare roots. This might be called the paleo diet, the so-called paleo diet, which if you do a Google on the internet, you will find quite a bit of information on the paleo diet. Some of it scholarly, a lot of it pushing a particular kind of sort of Atkins-like diet, heavy into meat and less into carbohydrates. The Yupik, some work by the University of Alaska Fairbanks researchers have suggested that Yupik in southwest Alaska, in the Kuskokwim area, have evolved to metabolize salmon, producing high resistance to diabetes, depression, and possibly other diseases. This is very interesting and pretty recent finding, and not surprising. The Yupik in that area, and the Dena'ina for that matter, in that area, have been relying on salmon for 4,000 years. Enough time to adapt to it. Of course, they aren't eating only salmon, as we will point out here, but salmon being the keystone species, the primary species, and have adapted to it. Many of the people, elders you talk to, say we need it. We need salmon. We have to have it. We can't have a diet without salmon. and it's expressing what scientists are now demonstrating. So the take-home point is that it may be an error to assume that pre-contact Denina, for example, had the same nutritional requirements as we acknowledge today. There may be some degree of adaptation, both biological adaptation and short-term adaptation, biophysical adaptation, to certain diets that is still to be worked out. Settlement pattern then, just quickly. Settlement pattern, the distribution, location of people within a territory is determined by subsistence, if you're a hunter and gatherer. And so we said at the very beginning of the class in one of the lectures that Canadian Athabascans in the eastern part of Dene territory, such as the Chipewyan, but also in Alaska, the Han, the Gwich'in, were primarily nomadic, living in tents, following caribou, salmon being less important. Semi-sedentary Koyukon, Tanana, other groups. Some log houses indicating near salmon streams, but also quite nomadic. And the Denina and Atna are sedentary, or at least semi-sedentary, in most parts of their territory, living in those stout log houses, nichils, that we talked about in the previous lecture, but also in temporary camps going out to harvest various foods. So semi-sedentary to sedentary, depending on territory. In the high salmon areas, streams, the Lake Clark area, Kenai, Kasilof River areas, the lower Susitna areas, Chewitna, MacArthur River areas, these areas would be primarily sedentary. So a little bit on what has come to be called folk taxonomy. It's a version of, or a branch of, I should say, cognitive anthropology, how people think about their world and how people organize their world, and this is called folk taxonomy. The organizations that were passed on from generation to generation as people perceived of their world. For the Denina, we know this from modern interviews, we know it from origin stories, we know it from ethnographic literature, and we can roughly piece it together this way. So there were humans, and this is in the upper left, there were Denina. Denina, recall, meaning the people. And the second category was dogs, Lika. So dogs are a category unto themselves. They're not animals, they're not humans. They're animals that live with humans and assist humans in the hunt. But at the same time, they're not humans, but would have animate characteristics much like humans, and indeed all animals would be perceived of to be having a soul or a soul-like quality. At another equal level are the warm-blooded animals, and here we'll insert the idea that the category is named by what is perceived to be by the people as the dominant species within that category. So warm-blooded animals are called Gaga, which is the same name for brown bear, Gaga. So brown bear would be perceived to be the dominant animal within that category, and so the whole category is called that. And that includes both animals and birds. So brown bear is Gaga as the dominant mammal. Of the birds, Chagagashla is the dominant animal. You may think that in terms of birds that it would be raven, or it would be eagle, or some other of those raptors or dominant birds. But no, it's the humble little chickadee, the Chagagashla. Our little friend is what that, our little creature is what that means. And we might gain insight into that by the two categories of birds, the Hay-Chagagashla and the Shan-Chagagashla. The Hay-Chagagashla are the winter birds, and chickadee is that winter bird. It stays here year-round. It seems to be everywhere in that northern boreal forest. You're out in the winter skiing or whatever you're doing, and there's that little chickadee-dee-dee, chickadee calling you. The Shan-Chagagashla are the summer birds, and they have two categories. I didn't put those on here. The Shan-Chagagashla involve the birds that come and pass through, such as snow geese. So snow geese will come to various places in Cook Inlet on their way up from the west coast somewhere, I think California, Oregon area. Pass through, stop and feed, and then move on to their summer grounds. Whereas Nutaki, the Canadian geese, they come and they stay, but then they go back again. So the real bird is the Hay-Chagagashla is the chickadee. And there's a bit of an analogy to people here. Most of you listening to this are winter birds. Stay here year-round. And some people come in the summer and they pass through, tourists. And some come and just live for the summer. And these snowbirds then go back home. So not surprising that the Dena'ina would perceive of the chickadee as the dominant bird. Trees then are called chawala. Chawala is the spruce, so spruce is the tree of trees. And so we'll talk later about categories of plants, particularly edible plants. But plants would be named after chawala, the tree of trees. Insects, this you could probably guess as the mosquito. Tsich, the mosquito, which is everywhere in the summer. Enough about that. And then the fish, fluka, the salmon. And of course it was recognized many types of salmon and many other fish as well, and again we'll talk about that, but the category fish is named after the dominant species, and not surprising, that is the salmon. So here I have a slide showing the major bird classifications, someone's little creature, the Chagagashla, the winter birds, the summer birds, and then the two categories, the migratory birds that stay all summer and the migratory birds that pass on through. Let's talk then about traditional Dena'ina subsistence as it would have occurred before European contact, but well into European contact. I'll categorize this as fish, land animals, sea mammals, birds, and plant foods. And should at the outset say there was a good deal of variation within Dena'ina territory as to the relative importance of these various categories. In general, a maritime adaptation was most important in Kachemak Bay, southern end of Dena'ina territory, and then progressively less important further north. Conversely, land animal adaptation was more important in inland areas, less important toward Kachemak Bay, which had a distinctly more marine adaptation. Kachemak Bay, we could also say, however, is at the margins of Dena'ina territory and is somewhat atypical. Closest thing to it would be some of the bays, Tuxedni Bay and so on the far side of, on the west side of Cook Inlet. So there's a great deal of variation within Dena'ina territory, and it's hard to characterize that. I think it still needs to be sort of analyzed further and spelled out. Salmon is everywhere important, but not everywhere equally important. Very important in the Kwijak drainage, meaning Lake Clark, Mulchatna, Iliamna area. Very important in the Kenai Peninsula with the Kenai, Kasilof areas. On the west side of Cook Inlet, the Chewit and MacArthur rivers, and in parts of the Susitna drainage, salmon is very important. But there would have been places where denina occurred in inland areas where they're at the sort of the far reach of where salmon migrate into. And as you know, they lose nutritional capacity the further they go up into the rivers, getting redder and redder before they spawn. And so in those areas, very likely land mammals were far more important. So bear in mind that there is variation. We're not saying it's one culture everywhere, equally dependent on the same resources. So what I've got is my handy-dandy scale of importance of foods. So we're gonna go through a list of subsistence foods adapted from Cornelius Osgood's book. You have that book in your reading packet. He has a list there of species that were important as he interviewed elders in the 1930s. But he's just got a list. So what I've attempted to do is give it a scale, a list of very important to least important, 1 to 5. So 5 is very important, meaning it's abundant, concentrated, or of high nutrient value. Salmon is a 5. And on down to least important. That means they're not very abundant. Or they're not concentrated, meaning you have to expend a lot of energy to get them, or they have low nutritional value. Mushrooms, for example, they might taste good, but they have a low nutritional value and little return for the effort. So bear in mind, this is subjective. It's kind of my own experience and understanding. I don't want you to think there's, you can certainly challenge the numbers. Oh, I think that should be a 2 instead of a 3, or vice versa. But I just want to give you a sense for how important these various foods are for the people. So we'll start with salmon and fish, and 5 species, as you know, the Hluka being the denina name. And I've got 5. I got 5 plus here actually, because salmon, that's the keystone species for the denina and for the other salmon cultures. And then I've also got the list of techniques for how those salmon, in this case, were taken. And so we've got V-shaped weirs, basket weirs, beach set nets, drag nets also. I don't have an illustration of that coming up, but simply taking a net and dragging it through the water. In some cases, a spear with a barbed point. And I want to talk just a bit about the first salmon ceremony. So let me go to the slide, the technique slide here. So these are some of the techniques. You've seen this slide in the upper left before. That was done. That was done by Bill Thomas, who was a student, and he researched Osgood's book and others. Osgood has this illustration here, where he's got the weir drawn this way, and then this sort of triangle affair here. And of course the fish come this way, and the current goes that way, and the fish are caught. So he drew this. He was a very good artist, and drew this illustration of how they might have been fishing. And it's a classic one, and he didn't put the little gate in here, but somehow when they weren't fishing, they'd open up a gate, and the fish would, of course, swim on through, and escapement would occur, and you wouldn't be fishing out your stream. Very efficient method of salmon fishing, and in this case targeting the silver salmon or coho salmon who go up side channels or go up small creeks tributary to the larger rivers. And we talked about that when we talked about archaeology. Another way were these or basket traps, pardon me. These were long, 12 feet long in some cases, made of these poles bound together. This is a side view, but it would be sort of oblong or circular, and would have this pole arrangement here, so the fish, once they got in, they wouldn't get out again, and there'd be a little opening where you could pick out the fish. I'm quite sure that these were not used where there were heavy runs. That would fill up pretty fast, so to speak, and you wouldn't use those in places where there's a heavy run of fish. The weir, the fishing weir illustrated over here, would be the technique you'd want to use there. But this would be a place you put it in the water, you leave it, you go away, and you do other things, hunt or whatever, come back at the end of the day or a couple of days, and there's your fish ready to go. All of these are going to imply minimizing effort and maximizing return. This style does not mean a corporate kin group is needed. This style does mean a corporate kin group is needed, because there's a lot of work to building the weir. You'd have to rebuild it every spring because of the ice, digging the cold storage pits and processing the fish and so on. This too would be energy labor intensive and probably clan based. So this is an illustration from Eliot. Eliot was here around 1900. I can't remember the exact years he was here. He was an American official that was surveying for, can't remember what he was surveying for, but as the course of what he was looking at, he described the Denina, and we're thankful that he did. So this is a weir that would be found on the coast, for example, possibly in a larger lake, but in the coast, fish run just offshore in some cases, particularly as they're heading for their natal stream. And so this is another type of sort of weir type operation built out like this. And the fish are diverted. So here they're coming, the fish are coming, and they're diverted out. And here's a guy with his spear, or dip net probably, dipping out the fish, bringing them back in. It's also possible that they had some kind of net mesh similar to set net fishing, but I'm guessing with all the logs and other kind of junk that floats up and down in the inlet, that was not too efficient. So dip net fishing out here, bringing the fish in to be processed. This is probably the style of fishing at, say, California Village. Later you're going to see a video, a virtual field trip to California Village, and this is type of fishing that would have been done on the coast. So up and down Cook Inlet, as the fish came in, they would be using these type of weirs. So salmon are important, and the people had a ceremony and a story that signifies that importance. And I'll tell you the short version. The complete version is in Osgood's book. It's called The First Salmon Ceremony. And so the traditional story goes like this. There was a young girl who was told by her parents and her elders not to go near the fish weir. So it would have been a weir similar to the weir here in the upper left. Don't go near the fish weir. But she was a headstrong girl, and she did. So she slips into the water, and her parents and the villagers are naturally distraught. They look for her everywhere. They can't find her. And finally, after long and arduous search, they give up. They can't find her. A number of years later, her uncle is at the fish weir and is picking out some fish that have been caught. And he lays them on the ground, on the grass, and he then takes them up to the village. But he goes back, he forgot a little one. And when he goes back, he sees in the face of the little salmon his nephew. His nephew who has returned. The daughter has spawned the salmon. The people and the salmon are one. The people are the salmon. The Dena'ina are the salmon people. And so the story is meant to reflect, I think, that connection. You cannot take the people away from the salmon or the salmon away from the people. It's very interesting that that then became the first salmon ceremony. So there was a ceremony that was held each year with the return of the salmon, which sort of was loosely based on the story where the fish are first laid out on the grass, and then they are butchered and shared among the people. And it would be considered to be a world renewal ceremony. The world is good again. The salmon have returned. We will survive. We will thrive. The world is good, and would be practiced each year with the return of the salmon. And you might imagine how important that event would be. Even today in Cook Inlet, you'll hear when the first kings start coming in, the kings are in. You'll hear it on the radio. You'll hear it maybe, around the coffee pot at work. Yeah, the kings are in. And in previous times, even more important. A version of that ceremony is still practiced today in many parts of Dena'ina territory, where the first king that is caught, or the first salmon that is caught in the spring, is shared among the people. It's butchered and cooked and shared among the people, especially among the elders, who appreciate it so much. A world renewal ceremony saying our world is good. We will continue to thrive as Dena'ina people. But there are other fish that were important. Remember, here's my little scale here of relative importance. Halibut. Halibut were taken by intertidal hook and line fishing, and I'll show you an illustration of that, so we'll move on. Candlefish or hooligan are very important. They will precede the salmon in the spring, and become the first fresh fish of the spring. Very oily by modern standards, but very important nutritionally and in volume-wise. So 2 to 3, maybe 3 more than 2 here. We'll just cross that out right there. It's my scale. I can do that because it becomes important. Although locally available, candlefish don't occur, or hooligan don't occur in all parts, particularly the very inland parts of Dena'ina territory. They were taken with dip nets, also a very sort of interesting way of ice fishing, reverse ice fishing, I call it. I need a place to draw here. I'm gonna draw it here. It would occur where there's an ice shelf that's sticking out into the inlet, and so so this is the land. This is where you can stand, and this is the bottom of the shore, bottom of the inlet, and this is an ice shelf here. And with the tides coming in, so with a flood tide coming in this way, they would cut a hole in the ice here, and these little fish would be forced up through the hole along with the water and out again, and the people just simply pick them up. An illustration, I think, of minimizing effort to maximizing return. I call that reverse ice fishing, and that would happen mainly in the spring. Herring were important, particularly in Kachemak Bay. It's not reported the name. The herring were fished out and are now extinct in Kachemak Bay. Were fished out in the 1930s by commercial herring operations, and that's a tragic story, a very tragic story that we should have fished out an entire species. It got to the point where there were too few and they did not return, and as far as I know now, there only are sporadic herring in Kachemak Bay, and there are, to my knowledge, no attempts to bring that species back. Trout, Ustlagi 3, important, but certainly don't occur in the volume of the salmon, but important particularly in winter for that fresh fish. But before the ice went out, drag nets, just taking a net, a person at either end, and dragging it through the water, taking them on shore, would have been practiced. Again, minimizing effort, maximizing return. Dolly Varden were important, probably the same drag nets, same thing with rainbow trout, fresh fish in the winter also. Tomcod, ice fishing, and used an interesting sort of thing. They take a piece of caribou on the end of a line and dangle it, and the tomcod grab onto that caribou skin and don't let go, and you pull them out. They also were said to be harpooned, although they seem to be pretty small to be harpooned. Flounder were important, level 2, not very important. Octopus, amaguk, it's either an Alutiiq or a Yupik word, amaguk. Just collect them, that'd be Kachemak Bay. Freshwater sculpin were apparently eaten. They're not a lot of meat on a freshwater sculpin, but they were. Same thing with a stickleback, but stickleback too stay over the winter and would be to some degree a nutritional fish. I didn't know that stickleback were even fished until just a couple of weeks ago. We were doing some interviews in Tyonek, and they talked about taking stickleback in the winter. So going back to halibut, this is how halibut were taken. So this is a shoreline, and here's a big rock, and you'd sink a pole in the ground here and dangle from a line the bait. So here's the bait, and you do this when the tide is low, and the bait would be about the height where a halibut would come along. And so the halibut comes along, grabs the bait, is hooked, is trapped, can't get away because of this line is tied to a log. Tide goes back down again, and you go down and pick up your halibut. Minimized effort, maximized return. Now this wouldn't occur everywhere in Cook Inlet because the slope of the shoreline is apparently critical. And so halibut fishers today know about that, and they know where the halibut are, or at least were, in terms of the near shoreline. So it wouldn't, as I say, it wouldn't occur everywhere, but it would occur in certain places. And where it did occur, it'd be very important because of the size of halibut and the amount of return you get for very minimal effort. A typical question I might ask you in a test would be, give illustrations of minimized effort for maximized return. This would be one you could use. Shellfish, then, are important locally. Depends on where. It's very specific. Mussels are very important. You just got to pick them. They're the easiest thing, and they have great volume. So I've got them listed 3 to 5 here, but mussels don't occur everywhere. So mussels are mostly restricted to beds further toward Kachemak Bay and in Kachemak Bay itself. Clams, same thing, are locally available. Here near where I live, Clam Gulch, just south of me, is a popular razor clam spot, and there's in great abundance. Other places, buttercat clams, redneck clams are important. So I've got them listed as a 3 because they would be an important spring resource. Various types of taking of clams. Just pick them. Some of them you just pick them out or rake them out. Clam pinning is sort of an interesting technique. It was if this is the the tide goes out and this is the sand, and here's your clam down here, and there's that little line that goes down, and there's a dimple on the top, right? So some of you have gone clam digging, and you know the way we do it now is you find that little dimple and you dig like crazy beside it, and you reach in and there's your clam. If you're good at digging, that assumes you've got a clam shovel. So what you do with clam pinning is you have a stick with the tip about the width of, say, a pencil, like those old yellow number 2 pencils, or maybe a little thinner. You cut it from anything, willow, birch, something like that. It's got to be supple enough to bend a little bit, but not so supple that it bends over on itself. A couple feet long, 3 to 3 feet long. And you run that down through that line, and it goes into the clam. I forget which end is up. I think the siphon is up and the foot is down. But anyway, it goes right through the clam and immobilizes it, so it can't move. As you know, rascals can move pretty fast, and if you're digging and digging poorly, they'll be gone before you get down there. But this immobilizes them so you can dig out easily without any difficulty, and there is your clam. Great for kids, by the way, for those of you who have little kids and go to Clam Gulch or some similar place, they can pin clams. A couple of years ago, a guy was taking this class from me, and I described this, and he didn't believe me, so he went down and did it, and sure enough, it worked, and he was so impressed he commercialized these sticks. He used brazing rod from welding brazing rod and put a handle on it and sold them for $10, but I'm afraid he didn't make much money because it's a whole lot easier with cut your stick and go down and do it. Doesn't cost you $10. Shrimp, 1 to 2, only in Kachemak Bay, and not a lot of meat on a shrimp. Cockles, 2. So shellfish were important, regionally important. So marine mammals then important again in certain areas. Harbor seal I've got listed as 3 to 5. Most places not so important, but very locally very important. South end of Calgan Island, for example, was a very important area for harbor seals. Some places in Kachemak Bay very important for harbor seals. Sometimes seals will go up rivers, and there they can be taken by blocking their path back to the ocean. Same with beluga and porpoise, but we'll get to that. So if you do get them, 5 is very important, but also they're elusive. How were they taken? One was swim stalking. You went out, you're in the water, they're on shore, and you sort of make movements like a seal, and then you go on board and club them. Also bidarka and bow and arrow with a harpoon arrow. Osgood describes a harpoon arrow on page 88. And perhaps from a bidarka with a harpoon, although that's a more a lutig style, and I think that was probably done, but doesn't seem to be done as much. Porpoise I've listed as a 3 just because porpoises don't seem to go out onto beaches, but again, lots of nutrition, lots of food energy if you can get one. Beluga I've got 4 to 5. Gunshi. So this was a very interesting technique that occurred only among the Dena'ina as far as taking beluga. And as you know, beluga are a resident population in Cook Inlet. And this technique was dependent on the straight shoreline of Cook Inlet. And so we're going to make a shoreline here. Here's the shore, and the land is over here. And a tree would be felled, a large tree sticking out at right angles to the inlet. And at high tide then, a man would be stationed out here on the end with a harpoon and the other end of the line tied off onto this tree. So here comes the beluga, and as it's swimming, it is diverted out by this tree to go around past the guy. He harpoons it, and because this stout line, probably a line maybe ironically actually made from the hide of a beluga, holds onto it, can't get away. And so when tide goes out and at low tide, the people go out and butcher their beluga, and there you have it. Again, minimizing effort, maximizing return, but a very unique way of taking beluga, and dependent on the very unique environment of Cook Inlet with the high tides and the relatively straight shoreline. Here the straight shoreline used to their advantage. In most cases, the taking of marine mammals is done in bays and inlets where the marine mammals go in to feed. Gunchi. Sea otter were important. Sea otter, it's debatable how extensive sea otter were in Cook Inlet. The Russians came in and organized some very large sea otter hunts, but they were not sustainable. And sea otter were taken primarily for their skin. The hide, as you know, is very luxuriant. The beluga, the porpoise, the harbor seal, they insulate by fat layers as mammals, but the sea otter insulate with their fur. And the fur has some of the highest densities of hair follicles per square centimeter as any other animal, and so that becomes the insulating layer, but also from a human standpoint a very excellent fur for robes and other types of things. Sea otter were taken by bidarka and harpoon, and as far as I know, were not eaten. There's some suggestion that there may have been taboos against eating sea otter because of their human-like qualities, but I don't think that's been worked out yet. Sea lions, the outer Kenai Peninsula, were taken for their skin, and we described the rope, that single cut of rope from sea lion that would have been important, and likely taken by bidarka and harpoon. Here's a harpoon, Dena'ina-style harpoon that Osgood illustrates. It's a standard harpoon, almost certainly the idea borrowed from the elutig. So this is the detachable head here, and this line here, it's connected to the foreshaft. So that's the foreshaft right there. And as you stab the animal, the harpoon goes in, it toggles so it can't come out. The float is thrown overboard. The animal dives, dragging the float in the water. If you recall Archimedes' principle, that float filled with air will weigh the equivalent of the water it displaces. So in other words, if you were to fill that float with water and hold it up and weigh it, that's how much it would be weighing, dragging through the water. And eventually the mammal tires out, has to breathe, and you paddle over, and now it's dragging two balloons through the water, or floats, and eventually tires out and you dispatch it. Another illustration of minimizing effort to maximizing return for sea mammal hunting. Land mammals then, very important in no particular order. Caribou, bejoh, caribou, 4 to 5, occurs, as far as I know, throughout Dena'ina territory. So both the meat, yeah, that's the 4 to 5, and the hide was important. And when we described technology, we described a lot of pieces of clothing that were made from caribou hides. Dogs were used to hunt caribou. Bow and arrow was used. We'll show you bow and arrows in a moment. It was also described that Denina could run down a caribou. And you would have to, of course, be very fit, and you would knife it in the back of the neck. And Pete Bobby is one who was seen running down caribou, a man who died in his 90s a couple of years ago. And run along, jump on the back, and that way, in historic times, he didn't have to utilize any shells, but also very important survival technique. They may have used caribou fences. Caribou fences are described further north. A fence is not a fence, but more a set of poles that sort of move out from a V, and the caribou herd comes in, and they tend to shy away from the poles, moving into a box canyon or maybe a fenced-in area from which they're dispatched. But I don't think anyone's ever found the fence, and the nature of the caribou on the Kenai Peninsula and possibly in the Susitna area was not the large herd animals as you would find them in the Mulchatna herd area over on the other side of Denina territory. More forest caribou, small groups. But in the Mulchatna herd, very likely caribou fences were used, but I don't think anyone has ever found them. 4 to 5 for caribou. And the hide's important. Same with the moose. So, Nigi. Many Denina stories talk about seeing the first moose around 1900. We know that the caribou were becoming extinct. The last sighted caribou was reported in 1917, and so at the early part of the 20th century, the caribou were becoming extinct, and the habitat was becoming more conducive to moose, and this is likely due to an extensive set of fires, some of which are natural fires that were triggered by probably lightning, but as a consequence of spruce bark beetle infestation. And some were artificially set by miners, particularly clearing land for mining that cleared large areas. And so what grew back was browse, was willow and birch that were conducive to moose habitat. So many Denina talk about moose moving in around 1900. And the caribou then disappearing. So biologists disputed that, so that remains to be worked out, but I tend to think that moose were not very prevalent, and the Denina were right, moved in, or at least became more prevalent in the 1800s, early 1900s. And they were taken by bow and arrow. I'll show you. I think I'm going to skip ahead and skip back, if you don't mind me doing that. No, well, it must be a couple of slides ahead, so we'll come back to this one. We'll get to it eventually. Beaver are very important. Beaver are very common. 4, maybe even a 5. The hide was used. The skin was used, almost like sea otter. The skin is very luxuriant and very good insulator. But the meat was also eaten. I've eaten beaver. It's very good. And so I've got it listed here as a 4, not quite the 5, but very important. And beaver were mostly snared coming out of their winter holes, late winter. Rabbits and kaba, rabbit, or hare technically. I've said rabbit, but they're technically a hare. 4, again, depending on the cycle. Very important, very abundant, perhaps not as nutritious food as some of the other things, but very abundant. And the skins were very important. Rabbit skin, very, very good insulator. and rabbit snares were common, and we'll show you some Dena'ina-style rabbit snares in a moment. Two types of bear, as you know, Kaga, the brown bear, and Elt Eshi, the black bear. Both important, not as important because they're carnivores, or they're omnivores technically, but not as abundant as caribou, moose. So I've got them listed here as a 3. And of course the skin of the bear was important. Bears also figure prominently in mythology, in stories, as a symbol of power of nature. They were taken when a man found a bear den. He would go back and announce it to the village, and that became his bear. And one way to take it was simply building a fire and directing the smoke in and asphyxiating the bear in the den. Again, an illustration of minimizing effort to maximizing return. But another type was to spirit, and I may have told the story, I don't know. That same Pete Bobby showed his daughter Helen how to spear a bear, and he used a spear. She was 13 at the time, so this would have been in the 1950s. Found the brown bear, got it to rise up on its hind legs, and speared it in the neck, driving the spear up into the base of the skull. And Helen was told this. I heard the story from Helen. I'm sure she's told it to many others as well. And she said, I was scared. I don't blame you, Helen. I'd be scared too. I get scared just thinking about it. So it was, this took a lot of courage to spear a bear. Pete Bobby, by the way, did this because of a Dena'ina prophecy. That prophecy is that this world is unsustainable, and that someday people will need to know the old techniques of living off the land. Didn't want that to happen. Didn't do anything to encourage that to happen. But just the observation that we are in an unsustainable world, and Helen would pass that on to her children. Would pass that on as a way to live off the land. Bears were also taken by pitfalls, particularly near the storage pits, the underground cold storage pits filled with salmon. So pitfalls were a very deep pit, covered over with, thin logs and so on, and then with spikes put into the ground, vertically sharpened spikes, probably spruce or birch. And so when the bear slips in, falls in, it impales itself to try to protect the salmon source. And I'll show you a picture of a bear snare here in a moment. Sheep, nuji, are taken. Sheep are 2. Their meat is probably not particularly significant. The skin would be significant, and other things like the horn for making spoons and other types of items. Dogs were used in taking sheep. Probably dogs were used in taking bear too, I might add, and bow and arrow. Porcupine, ganshi, I've got listed here as a 3, but it may easily be a 4. Porcupine were survival food, so normally people did not kill a porcupine even though they came upon one. Leave it for a time when there might be a hunter or somebody else out in the woods who was having trouble, because along with spruce hens, which we'll come to in a moment, the porcupine are the easiest game to take, and so it became a kind of survival food. In addition to the food, the grease was very important. The grease was a waterproofing or water-resisting agent that was spread on boots and other things. And the quills, as we talked about in the technology discussion, the quills were very significant as far as decorating garments go. So porcupine, I'm going to just change that. I'm going to make that a 4. Hard to draw with a mouse. We'll make that a 4. And they're taken with a bow and arrow or simply clubbed. Goats, esbai, mountain goat, 2. The horn again was important. The hide was important. But that's a lot of work to get a goat, and there's not a lot of them, so that reduces their scale number. And taken with dogs and bow and arrows. Then a lot of fur bearers. So the fur bearers all were taken with either snares or deadfalls, and I'll show you a deadfall, or blunt arrows. A blunt arrow was an arrow, but not a sharpened arrow point, a blunt point that would stun it, and then it would be probably clubbed or something else. So I haven't got a number here because they normally were not eaten. The food was possibly used for dogs, but Osgood mentions that they were not eaten. Although I find that curious in terms of squirrel, because squirrel is very edible. But some of the others, like land otters, smell terribly. They're not considered edible. So I'll just leave that for now. Osgood mentions they weren't eaten, so we'll say they weren't eaten. So marmots, muskrat, lynx, ermine, mink, fox, marten, squirrel, and land otter were all taken primarily for their skin, for their hides. Skins wear out, so you would be continually replacing them by getting new furs, new skins, tanning them, and making new garments. And there's a few others. Wolverine, idashla. Idashla means little friend, and that isn't meant literally as a little friend. It's sort of a euphemism, because wolverines were disliked. Wolverines would break into caches. Wolverines would partly eat a moose kill, for example, or a caribou kill, and urinate on it and make it largely unedible for anything else. Wolverine fur, however, is excellent, as we know. That's the good rough for a parka. So the fur would have been used, but also protection, just to keep them away from the village, because wolverines are a threat. Bow and arrows and deadfalls. Wolves, too, would be perceived to be a threat. The fur would be used, but it was said that wolves would be hunted out from around a village as protection for children playing and other sorts of things like that. Birds, then. Birds are variable. Of course, in the spring, the birds coming back are very important, and the eggs would be very important. So ducks and geese would be those two important spring birds. Listed them here as a 3. They were taken with various ways. One, the snares were common, but also with a slingshot. So the Denina slingshot is a long sort of cord, not cord, kind of a thong, which would be about an inch wide. Maybe, how long would that be? About 6 feet long, maybe. And depending on how tall you were, and you would double it over, and you'd hold it between your first finger and your middle finger, and the other end between the middle finger and the ring finger. So, and you put a rock in where it doubles on itself, and you spin it like a slingshot over your head, and you let go with one of the fingers. I would do it between my middle finger and my ring finger, and away the rock flies. And it's surprising how accurate you can be with this. At a distance of 20 yards, it doesn't take too long to be accurate within 2-3 feet, and I'm sure with a lot of practice you could be very, very accurate, very deadly with these as far as ducks and geese go. So that slingshot, I don't know the distribution of it. All I know is that's what the Denina used. Spruce hens or spruce grouse were also that emergency food. Talked about they were taken with a deadfall or clubbed if you could, They're the ones that flutter up away from you in the woods and scare you half to death, but weren't taken normally except as emergency food, and they're very nutritious, very edible. And, by the way, the feathers are very beautiful. Swans were eaten, again taken with the slingshot, possibly snared, but a lot of effort to get a swan. Same with loons. Ptarmigan probably more important, probably a 3, maybe even more than a 3, snared in the winter and providing fresh food in the winter. Gulls were eaten. We don't eat gulls today, but gulls were eaten. Not important, not highly important, but they were snared. Eagles were taken not for food, but for the talons and the feathers. And owls also relatively unimportant. They're a big bird, but there's not a lot of meat on an owl. So this is what I had forwarded to before, but it's way down the line here. So here we are with how to track a moose. And you might say to yourself, well, why do I need to track a moose? They're kind of just always standing right there. And I got some insight into that when I was out in the Mulchatna area, which is a relatively wild area. And I'm used to moose being used to me. And sometimes, to our detriment, but it's pretty easy to get close to a moose in the urban areas. But out there, they'd be a quarter mile away and they'd bolt if they saw you. So a lot more skittish, a lot more running from humans. So you would have to track them to find them. So the circles here are the moose trail. So here's the moose moving along, and it's looking for a place to bed down. And so you're coming, this is the human coming, and comes across a moose trail, and you don't turn and follow it because it'll know that. What you do is you make a big circle like this, and then you come back and see if you've got the trail. Yes. So the moose, meanwhile, keeps going and circles around into the wind to bed down. So you keep your pattern up. Oh yeah, there it is. Until you come across and whoop, no moose. Where is it? Must have bed down. So you do this to look for where it's bed down. Oh, there's the tracks. Now I know where it is. So that puts you right there, at which case you can dispatch the bedded down moose. Again, attempting to minimize effort to maximize return. These are some of the snares. This is a rabbit snare here. This would be a snare for a moose. You would hang that from a tree or dangle it somehow to catch a moose. This is for birds. This particular one is for birds. This is for rabbits also. Not sure what this is meant to, a denned animal. Maybe a bear. I guess you could do that with a bear. But snares are very important, and like most northern peoples, the Dena'ina had an amazing array of snares and deadfalls. So here are deadfalls, and both snares and deadfalls would be used primarily with fur-bearing animals, because that way you don't puncture a hole in them and the fur is still good. All of these, or most of these, are triggered with a figure 4 trap. Here's a figure 4 trap here, here's a figure 4 trap here, here's one here, and here's an inset of what a figure 4 trap looks like. Figure 4 trap was not unique to the Dena'ina. It was widely used over North America, and I don't know its origin, where it occurred, but it had this trigger mechanism. The bait would be put out here, and if you build this right, you just a slight touch on it will initiate, in this case, a log falling. Same thing here, logs falling, or this sort of platform-like thing falling. And I'm going to stop there, my talk here, and at this point I'm going to inset a short little video that illustrates the use of a deadfall trap. So the poor little she-wolf was trapped, and I should add that the string was because we didn't want to stick our hands in there and trigger the mechanism, but the string would not be part of that. So very effective, very minimizing effort, maximizing return. The Dena'ina have a number of stories that are a genre of stories called stupid boy stories. And one of the stupid boy stories involves a deadfall trap, such as you saw illustrated. And that was a scale model, by the way. The deadfalls would be, I don't know what that, 4 feet across or something like that. By depending on the animal you were gonna trap, something like that. So this stupid boy story, I'll tell you the short version of it. So there's a boy, and he asks his aunt if he could go check the deadfall trap, and she says, "Sure, go ahead." And then he asks, "If there's nothing in it, what should I do?" Well, that's a stupid question, correct? If there's nothing in it, you just leave it and go back later to check it. But she tells him, well, you just grab the bait. Okay. Stupid boy goes to the deadfall trap. He sees there's nothing in it. He crawls in. He grabs the bait. Later, his aunt and uncle can't find him. They go out and they look. And sure enough, his feet are sticking out from the deadfall trap. Well, these are pretty grim stories. They're we want our stories, our children's stories anyway, to have a good ending, and someone comes and saves the day, sort of Lone Ranger type stories. But Dena'ina stories don't have that good ending. At least the stupid boy stories don't have that good ending. And by the way, there is one stupid girl story, just to be fair. And these stories are meant, I think, to be educational. Don't be stupid, is what they're saying. We need you to be smart. We need you to learn your lessons. We need you to be observant. We need you to learn to make good judgments. Don't be stupid. Same lesson today. Same lesson we need from young people today. There's lots of problems in this world. We need you to learn your lessons. We need you to help solve the problems that face us today. Don't be stupid. Learn your lessons. We need you. So bows and arrows. Bows are really hard to photograph. This is a photograph in the Peabody Museum at Yale University. This is a close-up of Osgood's description of various types of bows. One was a sinew-backed bow, and A and B, these two are illustrating sinew-backed bows. So this is sinew, the backstrap of the moose or whatever animal anyway, or the ligament from the tendons in the legs. And so those ligaments would go the whole length of the bow. So as you pulled the bowstring here, you pulled this bowstring, so I don't know if this is a back bow or not, I can't tell from the photo, but if it were, the backing would go all this way, and this would be sinew as well. I'm not doing this all that great, but so you're pulling sinew against sinew. The wood is just there to sort of hold it. And these are very powerful bows. They would be used at short range. They would be used, say, for a bear or a moose or something like that at short range. Very powerful, but not so good for long range. So the unbacked bow, possibly letter C here, would be used for longer range shooting, but not so powerful. So you gotta have one or the other. You can have a powerful bow, not good for distance, or you can have a distance bow, not good, not with a lot of power. So you would have your bow according to what you're going to use it for. Quivers, of course, quivers were highly decorated, and the various types of arrows. So bows and arrows, critical to know how to make and to know how to use. Here's another quiver. This is a photo of one from the Peabody Museum. The upper right is a harpoon, and this is a copper, that would be a bear spear point. They don't have a scale on this, but this is likely about 6-8 inches from here to here, and this would be the haft, where it would be hafted onto a handle. And that would be the type of spear that you would use to kill a bear, and for other general purposes. It was said that all men carried a bear spear at all times. So this would be the general men's tool that they would have in their possession at all times. So, plants. Let's talk about plants. This is Osgood's list of plants. Priscilla Russell Carey, whose book I'll show you in a moment, identifies over 80 edible and medicinal plants in Dena'ina territory. So the list is much bigger than this, much longer than this, and very important. I've got them all listed 3 to 5, 3 to 4, except maybe down here with the spruce fiber and so on. But very important, adding to the diet, rounding out the diet. So pushki, that's that cow parsnip. That, by the way, has for some people with when there's bright sun, by brushing against the outside can be toxic. So don't be messing around with pushki and trying to eat it unless you really know what you're doing. Geiss is what the Dena'ina call it, geiss, and very abundant, very important, and fairly nutritious. Various types of seaweeds in Kachemak Bay, same thing. This is sort of a lump-all category seaweeds. Rose hips are important. Wild peas, wild onions, wild potato, all important. Wild potato more interior, also thought to be a survival food. Salmonberry, various types of berries, very significant, very important. As we know, you probably collect berries yourself. Blueberries, raspberries, high bush cranberries. Low bush cranberries, hay means winter berries, so you can occasionally find low bush cranberries where the snow isn't covering too much. They're still good. Even high bush cranberries. I come across those as I'm skiing. I'll eat them. So all of these were very, very significant. And others were important for medicinal reasons, and we'll talk about that at another lecture. Bark, spruce bark as fiber and birch bark as fiber were spring survival food. If times were tough, you could eat bark, especially once the sap starts flowing, gives you some nutritional value. Birch syrup was made, and 2 to 3 as a source of sugar. Ferns were important, particularly in the spring. Later on, they get pretty bitter. So can't underestimate the importance of the gathered plants for the Dena'ina diet. That the best information is from Priscilla Russell Carey's Dena'ina or Tenina plant lore, Dena'ina et Una, an ethnobotany of the Dena'ina of South Central Alaska. And if you ever see this book for sale, I would highly recommend getting it. page by page, it describes the plant, it describes how it was processed, how it was used, and its importance. Should note that it's not meant to be a guide to edible plants, to wild edible plants. It's an ethnobotany, and there's a difference. It's describing how the people used it. In many cases, there would be additional information that would be very important in order to know how to reduce toxicity, for example, or what time of year it needs to be collected, and other types of things. So I just want to urge you not to just strike out on your own, but to find someone who's knowledgeable. Do your research if you're interested in wild plants for food or wild plants for medicine. This is a remarkable book. It's got a wealth of information. And she interviewed elders. Many of these elders who are pictured here on the front cover are no longer with us. And so this information becomes lost as the elders die out. So we owe a great debt to Priscilla for doing this work. I want to end this with talking about Into the Wild, Chris McCandless. So many of you know the story of Chris McCandless as portrayed in the book Into the Wild, from which a motion picture Into the Wild was made. And this is from the motion picture. This is an actual picture of Chris McCandless, self-taken picture at the bus. So the story goes, he was a graduate with a degree in anthropology, by the way, of Emory University. He was from suburban Washington, D.C., grew up in that suburban atmosphere. And after graduation from college, family expectations were that he would go off and find productive work. But he didn't. He left his girlfriend, as portrayed here in the movie, and off he went on a vision quest, or what we would today call a vision quest. And he traveled many places. I can't remember them all: Mexico, California, eventually finding his way to Alaska, and set about to live off the land for a year. He bought a book. He bought a book in Fairbanks at the bookstore at the university, and the very book he bought was Priscilla Russell's Denina ethnobotany book, the book we just showed, and hitchhiked down to north of Denali National Park, and hiked in to an area. He crossed a couple of rivers, and he hiked in to this bus. And it's not that far in. I can't remember how far it's in, but it's, I don't know, 50, 60 miles in or so. And he decided that was as far as he was going to go, and he stayed. And he commenced to live off the land. I believe he had a .22 rifle or something like that, and he had her book, and he was gathering plants and living off the land. He died. He starved to death at the bus. Tragically, his journal documents it, and that story became the subject of John Krakauer's excellent book pictured in the lower right, called Into the Wild. And Chris McCandless has become something of a cult figure, particularly in Eastern colleges. If you Google him or Into the Wild, you will see many a course that delves into his life and his book, or the story of him, including, by the way, an article that I wrote about him. In Alaska, he's controversial. Some people think he was nuts for doing this. I don't. I understand what he was doing. When you go on a vision quest, you have to test yourself. But he also made two errors, I would say. Error number one is that living off the land is not an individual activity. Living on the land is about community. It's about being part of a group. It's about sharing resources. It's about sharing activities. It's about reinforcing one another. I had a student a number of years ago who came to class and very much in the Chris McCandless mindset. He wanted to learn about living off the land. He wanted to go out and live by himself. He rejected his roots, and he was angry. He was angry in class because I wasn't teaching that sort of thing. He wanted to know how you made a bow so you could go kill a moose. He wanted to know how to make a trap, how to make a snare, and as we've just covered, I covered some of that, but that wasn't the focus of it. And when we got to the section in Cook Inlet Anthropology about social organization, I don't remember exactly what I was talking about at that time, but I remember looking at him. There was a class of 15 or so at the time, and it was like the bell went off in his mind, like all of a sudden the lights came on, and his countenance changed. And he came up after class and he talked to me about it, and he said, "Oh, it's about community. It's not about being an individual. It's about being a community, and that's what the meaning of life is." And while he still pursued that understanding, he gave up the chance to, or the goal to go out and live by himself. And that's what McCandless did. He gave up community. He gave up his girlfriend, pictured in the lower left, at least in the movie version of it. He gave up his family and tried to strike out on himself, by himself. He also, a second lesson to be learned from Mr. McCandless, he had the wrong book. He had Priscilla Russell's Denina Ethnobotany, but he was not in Denina territory. He was north of Denina territory in a different ecosystem, with plants ripening at different times, with toxicity occurring in different ways according to different soil conditions. And many think it's because of eating a toxic plant, a plant that had been edible earlier in the spring, but as the summer wore on became toxic and he poisoned himself to death. We may never know exactly, but that's likely something like that happened. At the end of the book, Into the Wild, John Krakauer writes very movingly about going into the bus. They helicopter in with his parents and Krakauer himself. And the father very movingly puts a plaque in memory of his son on the bus. And they gather wildflowers as a kind of bouquet for the memory of Chris McCandless. And Krakauer lists those flowers: fireweed, wild geranium, monkshood. And when I got to the part about monkshood, a chill went down my spine. Monkshood is one of the most toxic poisonous plants in Alaska. If you have a cut and whatever it's called, juice from the monkshood that you picked gets into that cut, some say you have 7 minutes, depending on your size and other things. It's very toxic. It's the poison that a lutig used on their harpoons to kill whales, aconitum poisoning, monkshood. Very, very toxic. So how ironic and potentially tragic that Krakauer and the parents themselves might have died, in a sense for the same reason that McCandless did. Not understanding the territory, not understanding the land, not understanding the plants, not having that cultural wisdom that comes from generations of living off the land and moving into a territory you don't know. So that's a lesson, I think, for us all. What we're trying to understand here is how a culture lived in a territory and developed cultural wisdom and cultural knowledge to become not just survive, but to become sustainable. And in its tragic way, I thank Chris McCandless for helping teach us that lesson, and for that story. Thank you.